Welcome, learners, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're jumping straight into a really fierce legal and constitutional fight. We're talking about the 2025 deployment of federal forces, mostly National Guard, into major U.S. cities, places like Los Angeles, Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and this isn't just, another political headline. It's really a high-stakes constitutional stress test. We're going to be looking closely at how these actions are challenging some bedrock principles.
Like federalism?
Exactly. Federalism, civilian control over the military, and fundamental rights, things that really define American democracy.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Our mission here is to understand the legal boundaries being pushed. We've got sources detailing the Posse Comitatus Act, the pushback from states, and maybe most importantly, the precedents being set right now about using the military at home. This is pretty essential stuff if you're tracking presidential power.
Right. And to really get a handle on these deployments, you first need to understand the main legal hurdle, the Posse Comitatus Act, the PCA.
That's the 1878 law, right? The one keeping soldiers from acting like police.
Precisely. It limits the federal military's involvement in civilian law enforcement. And this idea, it's not new. It's deeply rooted in the founders' fear, their historical fear of a standing army being used against the people.
Okay, so that principle gets tested immediately in Los Angeles,
Yeah.
June 2025. This was a big one. We're talking 700 Marines, 4,000 National Guard troops.
And crucially, it happened amidst protests over immigration raids.
Yeah, and the administration went ahead, even though the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, explicitly objected. They just overrode him.
That decision, pushing past Newsom's refusal, that really set the stage for a landmark legal fight. Our sources show that on September 2nd, U.S. District Judge Charles Breyer came down with a pretty decisive ruling. He found the administration violated the Posse Comitatus Act.
And he was specific about why, wasn't he? It wasn't just the action, it was the motive behind it.
Exactly. He said the deployment was illegal because the justification, the stated reason for it, was, quote, contrived. He emphasized there was no rebellion, nor was civilian law enforcement unable to respond. Basically, the emergency wasn't real.
Wow. Contrived.
Yeah. He was essentially calling the emergency rationale a kind of legal fiction, right? Something designed to get around the rules. But maybe the most alarming part of his ruling was the warning he gave.
What was that?
Judge Breyer suggested the administration's actions and their rhetoric seemed like an attempt at creating a national police force with the president as its chief.
A national police force. I mean, how realistic is that fear? What exactly did they do that made him sound that alarm?
Well, it stems from the pattern, you see. They were trying to claim the power to use military force against protests without actually meeting the high legal standard required.
You mean like invoking the Insurrection Act?
Right. They wanted the power without declaring that kind of national crisis, which has huge political costs. So when you claim that power based on a contrived justification, you're essentially arguing for discretionary military power at home. And that directly challenges the separation of powers, our whole civil-military tradition.
It definitely looks political from the outside. The sources point out these deployments mainly hit Democratic-led cities. And it seemed like they used protests or crime stats to paint this picture of an existential threat, maybe for political gain.
And the blue states reacted immediately, organizing resistance because they saw it exactly that way as a political abuse of federal power aimed at undermining local control. Governor Newsom's lawsuit in California was very direct. He called it an abuse of power that trampled local authority.
And it wasn't just governors. The U.S. Conference of Mayors actually joined that lawsuit.
Right, which shows how deep the feeling went. They argued federal interference violates state and local rights, saying, local police are always better suited for crowd control nuances.
Then the tension really ratcheted up with Chicago. The president singled out Chicago, said it was next.
But officials there pushed back hard using data. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker called the threat an authoritarian power grab. He pointed out there was no emergency, and get this, violent crime was actually down significantly. Homicides down 30%, shootings down 40% around that time.
Wait, hang on. Crime was down 40%.
Yeah.
But the president threatened apocalypse now style action on social media. Doesn't that make the threat seem, completely baseless?
Yeah.
Or was that the point? Use the rhetoric to create the crisis.
Sources suggest it was the latter. Experts describe that kind of extreme militaristic language, like apocalypse now, as being designed to create a spectacle, to intimidate. When the facts don't fit the narrative, you use rhetoric to manufacture the perception of crisis.
Okay, then there was D.C. Also a deployment, but legally different because D.C. isn't a state.
Right. They used the D.C. Home Rule Act to federalize the local police department, a unique situation. But even there, polling showed almost 80% of D.C. residents opposed it.
And the political angle seemed pretty clear there, too.
Yeah, critics pointed out the troops brought in were from Republican-led states. States that actually had 10 cities with higher crime rates than D.C. at the time.
10 cities.
Wow. It strongly suggests the deployment was more about making a political statement in the capital than addressing an actual crime emergency where it was worst.
But then you have Memphis, Tennessee. Deployment announced September 2025. Memphis does have high violent crime rates, but the reaction was still split.
Exactly. The Democratic mayor, Paul Young, expressed dismay, said he hadn't asked for the guard, worried about the optics, but the Republican governor, Bill Lee, supported the federal task force.
So that Memphis situation really highlights it, doesn't it? These aren't just crime-fighting moves. They're tangled up in politics and this federal versus state power struggle.
Precisely. It exploits the cracks in that relationship.
Okay, that leads to the big question. If it was political, if states were resisting, if a judge ruled it illegal, and if the administration didn't want to use the Insurrection Act, how did they actually get troops on the ground legally? How did they navigate around the PCA?
That's where we get into some, let's say, less known statutes they tried to use. You mentioned the Insurrection Act. That's the big one, the main exception to PCA. Gives the president almost limitless power to use the military at home. But invoking it is a huge deal politically. It's basically admitting a massive national crisis or a rebellion.
So they wanted to avoid that headline. What did they use in LA instead?
Instead of the Insurrection Act, they leaned heavily on a statute called 10 U.S.C. Section 12406. And this is where it gets really interesting, legally speaking.
Yeah, so?
Historically, that specific law, Section 12406, is used for providing federal logistical support. Think transport, supplies.
Yeah.
And usually it's used alongside an Insurrection Act declaration.
Wait, so they used a law meant for logistics to justify actual law enforcement activities,
Right.
like policing protests.
That's the legal ambiguity they seem to be exploiting, using Section 12406 on its own as a basis for policing actions rather than just, say, providing helicopters. Well, it raises huge questions. Does it actually grant independent law enforcement power, enough to bypass the PCA? It really looks like they were searching for a legal gray area.
Trying to get the power without the political baggage of the Insurrection Act.
Exactly. Authority without the full accountability.
And then there's the National Guard itself. That whole status thing always seems confusing.
It is complex, but it's crucial here. The National Guard is usually exempt from the PCA when it's operating under state command. That's called Title 32 status. Think of them as wearing a state hat, even if the mission is federally requested or funded.
So under Title 32, they're technically state forces, even if the president asks them to deploy.
Basically, yes. Because they aren't fully federalized, that would be Title 10 status, the PCA doesn't strictly apply. This gives the president a way to deploy forces for domestic missions without triggering the PCA or needing a full emergency declaration. It's a loophole, essentially.
But okay, regardless of the legal hat they're wearing, Title 32, Title 10, the practical problem remains, right? Soldiers aren't police officers.
Absolutely. That training disconnect is fundamental, and it's historically dangerous. Soldiers are trained for combat, M16s, grenade launchers, defeating an enemy. That's their world.
Which is miles away from community policing.
A universe away. Community policing is about de-escalation, use of force continuums, protecting rights, not just neutralizing threats.
Our sources even brought up that incident from the 1992 LA riots.
Yes, a chilling example. Marines were deployed then too, playing a law enforcement role. A police officer apparently yelled, "Cover me," during a domestic violence call. The Marines, falling back on combat training, interpreted that as needing suppressing fire.
Oh no.
They riddled a house with over 200 bullets. Mercifully, no one was killed, but it shows the risk. And even internal military documents from the 2025 LA deployment showed serious concerns. Fears that mistakes could have far-reaching social, political, and operational consequences. They rated the risk to civilians and the military's own reputation as extremely high.
So if the goal wasn't just crime reduction, and the legal basis was, as the judge said, contrived, then what was the goal? Critics argue it was darker. To create confrontation, maybe fuel a cycle of protest, then crackdown, then more protest.
Political theater and intimidation is how some described it. Designed to discourage dissent, make people afraid to speak out.
And that kind of theater has real effects on rights, doesn't it?
Huge effects. When you start normalizing the sight of armed troops on city streets, It erodes that deep-seated American fear of a standing army the founders worried about. If people think protesting peacefully might mean facing down combat-trained soldiers, well, that chills free speech and assembly pretty fast.
Self-censorship kicks in.
Exactly. Most people will just choose silence if the potential cost seems that high.
And this isn't just about temporary deployments, is it? Our sources mention a bigger shift in military thinking.
Yeah, that's a major point. The Pentagon apparently unveiled a draft national defense strategy, and reportedly, it prioritized domestic and regional missions over traditional big adversaries like Russia and China.
Wow, that's a fundamental change.
It's a seismic shift. When the military's core strategy starts looking inward domestically, it signals a potential long-term acceptance of a quasi-policing role. It blurs those crucial lines even further.
So pulling it all together, what does this mean for you, the listener, trying to understand the limits of presidential power?
Well, this pattern of threats, deployments, and legal maneuvering looks like a very conscious, aggressive effort to test the boundaries of executive power. By trying to deploy the military domestically over state objections, using these questionable legal workarounds like Section 12406, it looks like an attempt to set a precedent.
A precedent allowing the president to bypass traditional checks like federalism and the PCA.
That seems to be the goal, according to critics, establishing that the executive can use the military this way, regardless of state wishes or existing laws, unless maybe a court steps in forcefully.
So, connecting this to the bigger picture, these legal fights over the PCA, federalism, executive power, they're really fundamental, aren't they?
Absolutely foundational to the republic. The core question the courts are grappling with right now is whether these constitutional norms, these limits on military policing, can actually hold up against repeated pressure.
Okay.
Especially when the reasons given for intervention keep getting called out as legally weak or well-contrived.
Which raises a really important question for all of us, I think.
Yeah.
Will the public just get used to this? Will we become accustomed to seeing armed federal forces on our streets? And will that slowly erode those historical legal distinctions between soldiers and police that the founders were so adamant about protecting? That's definitely something for you to mull over as these cases move forward. This has been a deep dive into the 2025 federal deployments and the constitutional battlegrounds they've opened up. We really hope this has given you the knowledge you need to stay informed on this critical issue. If you found this exploration valuable, please subscribe, share this deep dive with someone who could use the shortcut to being well-informed. And comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts on where that line between federal and state authority should really be drawn in times of crisis or unrest. We'll see you next time.